Well, good morning, everyone. I'm really looking forward to today. Welcome to what I think will be a really great presentation. I'm going to start the meeting by reading the land acknowledgement. Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Okay, let's have a look at our today's meeting. So after our guest speaker, our panel is going to ask a few questions, and then we'll open it up for your questions. We have an action of the day and some information on upcoming events. Please join us if you can at 11:30 for an after chat. It's a real pleasure to introduce our guest, Jason Dion. Jason has been at the center of many of Canada's major policy discussions. He's currently the Mitigation Research Director at Canada's leading climate policy research organization, the Canadian Climate Institute. And I have to say that the Institute really is an invaluable resource for those of us who are not experts, but want to better understand and advocate for sound policy. I said he's been at the center because before moving to the Institute, he was the lead researcher at Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission. And the commission was formed by a group of economists early in 2014. And their work was really seminal in the adoption of Canada's carbon tax. So he really has been, as I said, at the center of many policy discussions. He's also worked at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Jason has a really very long list of studies that he's been involved with, and I put a few of the titles, but you can find many more of them on the Institute's website. So why don't we turn now to what we're here for, and that's for Jason to speak to what we have to do in Canada to align our electricity systems with net zero, AKA the big switch. Thanks, Jason. Really appreciate you coming.
Yeah, thanks for that intro, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you guys today. The name of the work is The Big Switch, Powering Canada's Net Zero Future. So I'll be presenting it today. I wanted to also acknowledge some of my colleagues that were involved in this work: Caroline Lee, Anna Canduth, and Christiana Gertin. Usually I partner with them on this presentation. I'm going to do the other people's part today. So this is one of my first times actually speaking for their parts. So bear with me here. So what do we mean by the big switch? Well, simply put, we're talking about the switch from fossil fuels to non-emitting electricity in our homes, vehicles, and businesses. So for example, it means swapping our natural gas furnaces for heat pumps and our cars for electric vehicles. It means electrifying almost everything, recognizing there are some things like heavy-duty transport, some industrial sectors that are hard to electrify, and they might rely on other solutions like biofuels and hydrogen. But this graph shows the big switch on the path to 2050 at the household level, where you can see energy from electricity rapidly replacing fossil fuels on the path to net zero. So we decided to do a report focused on the big switch because it underpins all possible pathways to net zero in Canada. In our 2021 report, Canada's Net Zero Future, electricity was the only energy system that grew under all of the 60+ possible pathways to net zero that we looked at. And we found similar results when we were looking at other studies. So what this tells us is that failing to set up electricity systems to support net zero would undermine our achievement of that goal. Now, not only is making electricity non-emitting, so the production of electricity, an important source of emissions reductions, so too is switching from fossil fuels to that electricity to power our homes, vehicles, and businesses. And finally, the benefits of the big switch extend beyond meeting our climate targets to also creating important clean growth opportunities. Original research from the Institute shows that transforming electricity systems will create new sources of economic growth and employment. So here we're seeing analysis from the Institute's Sink or Swim report, which shows that Canadian companies active in the sector are well positioned to prosper in the global low carbon transition. And low carbon electricity itself can also make other Canadian industries, like steel and aluminum, more competitive in the global marketplace as buyers and investors increasingly place a premium on emissions reductions. Now here we're seeing new analysis commissioned by the Institute for this report, which shows job growth across the electricity sector on the path to 2050. Our analysis finds that investment to align the sector with net zero would result in more than 250,000 direct and indirect jobs in 2050, almost tripling current levels, with wind, solar, storage, and nuclear seeing the most job growth. And this is just employment on the generation, transmission, and distribution side. So it's just the supply of electricity. It'd be even more when you're thinking about the demand side and electrification. Now, what these two graphs confirm for us is that the electricity sector can be a source not just of energy, but also prosperity. While the big switch has implications for both supply and demand sides, our focus here is on the supply side, so specifically electricity systems. And just to be clear, by systems, we mean not only the networks and infrastructure associated with the generation, the transmission, and the distribution of electricity, but also all the relevant players and institutions involved. So that includes governments, utilities, regulators, system operators, indigenous peoples, and others. Our primary goal with this project has been to illuminate the path forward for electricity systems in Canada, both in terms of technical and policy pathways. We've split the technical and policy discussions into two separate reports and also produced a summary report called The Big Switch to highlight the key takeaways from both. Now, the first report, Bigger, Cleaner, Smarter, describes what changes are needed to align Canada's electricity systems with net zero. And the second report, Electric Federalism, outlines how governments can drive and enable these changes in the context of Canadian federalism. So normally I'd pass the mic to Caroline, who'd do Bigger, Cleaner, Smarter, but I'm doing it all today, so I'm just going to keep going. So in this section, we'll provide an overview of one piece of analysis assessing the what. So what changes need to be made in Canadian electricity systems from a technological perspective to align them with net zero. So the primary objective of this analysis was to describe the ways electricity systems must transform from a technology perspective to be compatible with economy-wide net zero by 2050. So to figure this out, instead of doing our own modeling, we sort of took a look around when we started this project and recognized, in fact, there's a lot of recent, really good, high-quality modeling studies, and what's needed is clarity about what they say is a body of literature. So looking across them. So we've taken a close look at these key studies, and we've also consulted with a lot of experts and academics and practitioners all across the sector, all across Canada. And really trying to zoom in on, well, what is true no matter what? You know, what is consistent across all of this? And where is there more uncertainty and divergence? So let's get into some of the top line findings. You know, the title of the report, Bigger, Cleaner, Smarter. Electricity systems have to become these three things in order to align with net zero. And by smarter, we mean more flexible. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit. So let's talk about each of these in turn. So first is bigger. So this is what clearly emerged from our analysis, that as we're shifting from fossil fuels to electricity, we're going to need more electricity. And that's not a surprise. So meeting demand from electrification is going to require a lot more electricity. And we found that that demand is going to grow by 1.6 to 2.1 times. So as much as doubling of how much electricity we're using. But in fact, that means the systems that are going to deliver that electricity have to grow even more than that. So we found that at least it's a doubling, if not more than a tripling of electricity capacity. Now, the reason why the capacity of our systems has to grow more than the amount of demand that's going to grow is because this future electricity system is going to rely on a lot more wind and solar, which produce electricity variably and intermittently, so not all the time. So a higher capacity of these sources is needed to produce the same amount of electricity as the more traditional grid we have today. So we're going to really have to grow our systems. Now, extremely important to note here that this growth in supply that we're talking about is occurring alongside improvements in energy efficiency. And all the modeling studies showed this as being critical. So that means that energy efficiency is tempering what would otherwise be even higher growth in electricity supply needs. So, but even as the economy becomes more efficient, even as we're investing in pursuing in energy efficiency, electricity generation and capacity still have to grow substantially. So what this means is we have to be pursuing both energy efficiency and growing the systems at the same time. So that's bigger. Let's go to cleaner. The second major change is that systems have to become cleaner, so reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that they generate. Now, this is probably the most obvious change that we think about when aligning systems with net zero. And it actually has three different pieces. One is growing clean electricity sources. The second is phasing out the polluting ones. And the third is maintaining our existing base of non-emitting ones. So let's talk about each of those quickly. Now, this figure shows projections of electricity generation associated with unabated fossil fuels. So unabating meaning generation that's not equipped with carbon capture and storage. Now, as you can see on the path to net zero, unabated fossil fuel generation sees a decisive decline, and it's making up at most 1% of total generation by 2050. Now, some of these studies were conducted before the federal government's target of net zero electricity by 2035. So honoring that target, sticking to that goal is going to mean following the bottom line of that range that you see there to get there by 2035. So it's the more aggressive of some of these scenarios and findings. So that's the first one, getting fossil fuels out of the mix. But in order to get those fossil fuels out of the mix and still grow supply at the same time, doing both at the same time, you really have to accelerate the deployment of clean sources. And the sources that see the greatest uptake by far in the modeling are wind and solar. And they play such an important role because they are just such a low-cost source of power, even with those lower capacity factors. So even though they're not producing all the time, they're still cheaper. And to the point that the IEA has been crystal clear, this is the cheapest source of energy available in the world today. The IEA being the International Energy Agency. Now, this figure shows what this growth means in terms of what kinds of capacity we're adding in the next decade. And you can see that to 2030, the majority of the capacity we're going to be bringing online can and should be wind and solar. And when you account for storage as well, what these studies show is that 2/3 and as much as 95% of new additions should be wind and solar and storage. So the key message here is whatever Canada's building in the next decade, a significant part of it needs to be wind, solar, and storage if we want to be compatible with our net zero goals. So that's cleaner. Or sorry, not cleaner. That is the getting renewable sources built out. Now, the third part of cleaner, which is maintaining our existing base of non-emitting power. So this graph shows across the studies how the generation mix changes on the way to 2050, on the way to net zero. So you can see hydroelectricity in light blue, that's at the top. We have lots of hydro in Canada. Nuclear in dark blue, a significant base there. These are the major legacy sources of non-emitting power in Canada. And they play a relatively steady role to 2050 in most cases. But where they don't, where these are going on their way out, or we don't continue to invest and maintain them, other sources have to grow even faster. So what this means is that maintaining these existing sources is going to require our attention as well, or else we have to do even more with the other things that we're going to be building. So I'll leave it at that for now. So that's cleaner. So you can see there's different paths that are possible for the generation mix. All of them involve a role for these non-emitting existing sources and a growing one for wind, solar, and storage. So now let's move to the third piece of the puzzle, which is smarter. And by smarter, we mean more flexible, that systems have to become flexible to support more solar and wind, but also to boost resilience to climate change, to be adaptable to extreme weather events. So what do we mean by flexibility? Flexibility in electricity systems refers to the ability for systems to respond to fluctuations in supply or demand. Now, those fluctuations can and will come from the variability of solar and wind, which in a net zero world is a big driver of why you want flexibility, but it's also important for other reasons, such as to accommodate changing load and demand patterns that come with EV charging and more use of heat pumps to heat homes, and also disruptions due to extreme weather events. Now, in the past and until now, including today, the firm dispatchable sources of supply, of electricity supply, have been natural gas plants. They've been where we get flexibility. You can turn them up when you need them and turn them off when you don't. But they emit GHG emissions. So in a world moving to net zero, we have to look to other sources of flexibility. And the important thing is there are other sources, and we've really put them under this umbrella term of flexibility to say that, look, we don't think of these. Oh, I see my menu's in the way there. I'll move that out of the way. Sorry about that. We don't always think of these things as belonging in the same basket. And that's something we've really tried to hammer in this work, that in fact, they are the same things for the purposes they're going to serve this future grid. So we can think of supply side solutions of flexibility. This is the dispatchable sources of power. It includes natural gas today. That would have to be equipped with carbon capture and storage to be consistent with net zero. But another source of flexibility that Canada has tons of is hydroelectricity. That is a great complement to wind and solar. So in the regions that have it, that's the obvious solution. But other things can be done as well. Grid solutions, so connecting across regions, so demand and supply fluctuations can cancel each other out by sharing and trading electricity across jurisdictions, including and especially hydroelectricity, that we can match these regions that have it with those that don't. Also storage solutions, so batteries and all these other emerging storage technologies can save the power that's generated by wind and solar to use it later when we have a greater need for it. And another one is demand side solutions. So technology is making it really possible for us to have appliances in homes, demand from industry, responding to when power is available and not. So that when we have a peak that's hard to accommodate, these things can power down and power back up again when wind and solar are generating. There is growing experience with all of these things. There is varying degree of readiness. There's a bunch of different technologies involved, but frankly, anybody who tells you you can't do net zero in power because the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, well, you know, did you look at this recently? Like, the technology space has evolved a lot. Canada has hydroelectricity, which can totally do this job. So this is something we need to think about. And I can talk more about how we need to think differently about it in the way we manage power systems, but it's the third priority: bigger, cleaner, smarter. Smarter meaning more flexible. So what does all this mean for Canada? First, it's important to emphasize that meeting this challenge of decarbonizing electricity requires attention to driving all these changes, including the less obvious ones of becoming bigger and smarter or more flexible, in addition to the need to get cleaner. Now, our analysis shows that there are uncertainties along the way to a net zero future for electricity. We don't know how some of these technologies are going to play out, but we examined enough technology pathways to align systems with net zero that we can determine the overall transformation is technically achievable. At the same time, we know this is a massive, complex undertaking that requires overcoming major technology barriers, but also social, political, and institutional ones. So it's not solely a technological problem, not at all. Now, so far we've been talking about this technology perspective to aligning systems with net zero, but our analysis shows that to drive these changes, you need policy. And that means that different orders of government are going to have critical and complementary roles working in partnership with Indigenous peoples to drive these changes we've been talking about so far. So to conclude, there are things we know with confidence about this transition. It is not just all uncertain. Bigger, cleaner, smarter are the things we have to do. What that involves specifically can vary. There are parts of it we don't know for sure, but that is crystal clear when we look across the literature and talk to all the experts. This is the job we have to do. Okay, so we've been talking about bigger, cleaner, smarter. We're going to pivot now to this findings and recommendations from our second report, Electric Federalism. Now, this second report discusses the specific actions that governments can take to enable market players and other actors to drive the changes we've been talking about till now. Our specific focus is on policy that can create the conditions that will drive a transition that is effective and cost-effective and fair, while also recognizing and respecting provincial, territorial, and federal jurisdiction. So there are lots of ways governments can pursue this, and the choices they make have significant consequences. Getting it right or wrong will have big implications well beyond the electricity sector. So let's go through 4 key stakes. First, early and effective action, including making systems more resilient to climate change, can reduce costs and avoid a more difficult transition later on. So we want to get moving. Second, strategic action to transform systems can unlock clean growth opportunities. So the export and employment opportunities I was talking about earlier in the presentation. Third, these transformations can and should be pursued in ways that support equity. Without equity-focused policy, these new investments could land disproportionately on low-income ratepayers. And so we really need to pay attention to that risk. And I'm going to come back to that a bit later. And finally, catalyzing Indigenous leadership and participation in the transition can support Indigenous self-determination and reconciliation. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it is super important. We have a scoping paper written by Indigenous Clean Energy, who have been at the front lines of deployment of renewable energy in Indigenous communities, Indigenous consent to renewable energy projects. Lots of great ideas in their scoping paper, and I'd encourage you to take a look. So we'll now turn to the key challenges facing electricity system transformation in Canada. So from the very beginning in this project, our goal was to not provide a comprehensive review of every potential barrier and challenge. Instead, we wanted to identify the most critical ones, along with a handful of corresponding policy solutions that could enable broader transformative change. So based on lit review, expert input, and extensive consultation, we boiled it down to 4 key challenges. Not to say there aren't others, but these are the ones that we really zeroed in on. Now, if left unaddressed, these challenges could significantly impede Canada's progress to net zero. On the other hand, if they're successfully addressed, they could accelerate the transition and help produce good outcomes across the stakes I described above. Now, there are 4. What I'm going to do is kind of go relatively quickly through 2 to spend more time on the other 2 that I want to sort of nudge you towards in terms of the discussion and focus here. But again, happy to speak to any and all of it in the Q&A. So the first challenge, and this is one I'll go, I'll spend some time on the nature of the challenge, but I'll go a little quickly through the solution, is that federal climate policy in the electricity sector is not currently aligned with net zero goals. So first, the current output-based treatment of electricity under the federal carbon price, so it gets a special treatment, doesn't really provide the incentives that you need for non-emitting generation, and it has weak incentives to ramp down use of unabated fossil generation. And while the federal government has proposed a new clean electricity standard, it hasn't yet been implemented. So that's the first challenge. More policy is going to be needed to drive, especially the cleaner parts of that change. Now, the second challenge is that utility investments in electricity system infrastructure could put upward pressure on electricity rates. Now, for reference, our research shows that these incremental investment costs could be around $15 billion per year out to 2050. While our report, Canada's Net Zero Future, found that households across all income groups in Canada would see falling energy costs as a share of income on the path to net zero, we also find in this report that electricity rates may rise in some regions. So I want to unpack each of those in turn because I think it's really important. So this figure shows how the costs of energy as a share of income, that's what you're seeing in green, would evolve on the path to net zero. Now, importantly, it's an all-in figure. So not only expenditure on electricity and fossil fuels like natural gas and gasoline, but also the equipment that those types of energy power, like cars and furnaces. It also shows how the expenditure on electricity as a share of income, that's what you're seeing in yellow, would evolve. So the yellow is the electricity portion of that total spending seen in green. What the projections show is that households across all income groups would see falling overall energy costs as a share of their income, even as their use of and expenditure on electricity rises. So it's really important we bear that in mind. Now, I always got to say it again, just to be clear, the big switch can make energy more affordable for Canadians. But now let's talk about how the price of electricity could be affected. Now, to better understand this, we commissioned some new first-of-its-kind modeling in Canada that looked how all these investments to align systems with net zero could affect the average cost of electricity. So it's a pretty comprehensive deep dive. It includes things like what are utilities' current debt burdens that would still need to be paid off. So it's a pretty close look at what this would look like. And what the modeling shows, and it's built on top of all of these other modeling studies I was talking about till now, is that electricity rates might only modestly increase or even decline, given decreasing costs of renewables and storage. But in some regions, in some scenarios, rates could increase more significantly. Now, this matters a lot, even with total expenditure on energy as a share of income falling, as we showed in the previous slide. The real, or even just the perceived risk of rising electricity rates, I know most of you live in Ontario, so we all know this very well, that can create significant challenges for electricity system transformations. Rates can be a political third rail. Higher rates could disproportionately impact lower income ratepayers. They could undermine the incentive for electrification because when power is more expensive, there's less incentive to get an EV or a heat pump. And they could undermine political support for climate action more broadly. So we've seen the blowback of the feed-in tariff program and its design and its perception that it raised costs of electricity in Ontario, even though there was a lot more going on than that at the time. So there's clearly a lot at stake in this larger transition, but there are things we can do. Smart policy can mitigate potential upward pressure on rates and help keep electricity affordable. And we have some ideas for that I'll return to below. Now, this third one is it gets in the weeds, but it's kind of the most important one, at least for today's purposes, that I really want to zero in on. Now, it's this third challenge that the big switch requires clear climate policy at all orders of government. But setting policy out decades in advance would be unduly rigid. So some amount of gap is always likely to remain between our existing policies and our longer term ambitions. But that gap creates challenges for key public institutions involved in the electricity sector. So regulators, public utilities, system operators. So a first challenge there is that while regulators have a clear mandate when it comes to ensuring reliable service and reasonable prices, their mandates as they relate to the realization of long-term climate goals are often unstated or they're ambiguous. The result is that investments in net zero consistent infrastructure can sometimes get interpreted as being at odds with ratepayers' interests. But an underlying challenge here is that while regulators consider existing policy and they're already in the business of making long-term decisions in the face of uncertainty, they are not in a position to make assumptions or decisions about what future climate policy could or should look like. That's the job of government. So even with clarified mandates for them, a challenge is likely to remain here absent some kind of intervention. So again, I wanted to spend a little minute here. I'm going to spend even more time on the solution when we come back to there. But first, the fourth and final challenge. Now, it's not a new one. And I'm going to go a little quickly through here. Happy to spend more time on it in the Q&A. For decades, there have been calls for better coordination and integration of the Canadian electricity sector. And while there's been some progress, provinces are mostly siloed from each other. We trade north-south a lot more than we trade and coordinate east-west. Now, there's formal barriers to better coordination integration. There's informal ones. So it's tough. And there's always been a case for greater integration. So you might ask, well, what are the odds of us overcoming it now, given we haven't done it till now? And what we'd say here is that the imperative to decarbonize strengthens the case even more because it represents such a cost-effective path to net zero. It's sort of a funny quirk of geography that every province that has a significant base of hydroelectric power has a neighbor that will decarbonize with wind and solar. So the complementarity is clear. It's there. Now it's likely we're going to see different levels of interest in this across the country, and we have ideas for how we can drive it forward, but it's going to remain a challenge. But it's something we should really keep the pressure up on because it's just so important from a cost effectiveness perspective. Pause here because I know it's mostly an Ontario audience. As Ontario is thinking about its future pathways, the fact that there is not a greater role and consideration of just importing more power from Quebec is frankly crazy, that we need to be closely considering the costs and benefits of doing that, and more to the point, the costs of not doing it. If we aren't clear about how much value we're leaving on the table by not going ahead with that, I think we're not making an informed decision about Ontario's future electricity system. So again, happy to return to that a bit later. So let's turn to solutions now. And we provide a policy recommendation for each of these four challenges, as well as a fifth one that seeks to tie all this together in a coordinated way. And I'll probably go through that a little quickly, just in the interest of saving more time for the Q&A. So our first recommendation is that the federal government strengthen climate policies in the electricity sector. And we have two recommendations that I'll just allude to at a high level. Happy to get into it in more detail, or you can check the report on that. That we suggest they move away from output-based pricing and just do full pricing in the electricity sector, but take all the revenues they collect from that and return it to a province's ratepayers. So give it back to them on the bill while giving the same strong incentives to the utilities to decarbonize. So that's our solution there. And that they pair that with a clean electricity standard that really shores up the certainty and the incentives provided by that carbon price signal, and that ensures delivery on that 2035 target of net zero. So the idea is these two things should work in tandem, and ideally you want both because they can do different things. Again, happy to speak to that in more detail, but I'll leave it at that for now. Our second recommendation, I want to spend a minute here, is that to address the challenge of potential upward pressure on rates, governments invest in electricity systems using public funds. So governments routinely invest in transport infrastructure, transit, roads, highways, without an expectation that the full cost would be recovered solely from users. And we think there's a case for doing the same with electricity. The case for it is threefold. First, bearing the cost of electricity investments more broadly makes sense because the benefits of those investments also spread broadly. Historically, the main beneficiaries of these systems were their users, so it made sense to recover all of the costs from them. But in the net zero transition, we're using electricity systems not to deliver benefits just to users, but to society as a whole in the form of emissions reductions. So it makes sense that the larger tax base should bear a portion of the cost. Second, it's a vital category of infrastructure. It's an energy system that's already in near universal use. It's only going to become more vital to a modern economy. And it's critical to addressing climate change. So it's vital infrastructure. Third, funding a portion of these investments out of the tax base offers a fairer way of paying for them, since tax systems tend to land less heavily on low-income households than ratepayer cost recovery. So we make the case that both federal and provincial governments should do this. Lots of ways to do it. Tax credits, co-funding a big project. The instruments are almost beside the point. Really, the point for us is that we make these investments in electricity systems to push down that pressure on rates. And we have lots of detailed ideas for how that can work in practice, but make big public investments is something we'd really sort of like emphasize in this. That's the headline for us. It makes sense. Of all the things to pour public money into in this transition, electricity systems makes a lot of sense. So here's that challenge again of that policies and institutions at the provincial level that I really want to zero in on. So this recommendation recognizes that provinces and territories hold many of the key levers needed to transform systems. So it's critical that they act. Now, while federal climate policy can do some of the heavy lifting here, making systems not only cleaner, but bigger and smarter requires that provinces and territories also use their tools. So we recommend a few specific things here, and I want to be specific because I think it matters. First, we recommend that provincial and territorial governments design and implement their own electricity sector climate policies. So don't wait for the federal government, make it your own at the provincial level. And that way, if those policies get withdrawn federally, you still have the provincial ones in place. Second, we recommend that these governments clarify the mandates of key public institutions, regulators, system operators, public utilities, to include delivery on emissions reduction goals. But this is the critical part. However, that's not enough. To enable those actors to fulfill those updated mandates, our third recommendation is that provincial governments develop comprehensive energy plans. These plans are developed by governments to support decision-making from regulators and other market actors. They provide clarity on things like intentions around building retrofits and energy efficiency, the future role of the gas network, the envisioned uptake of electrified energy uses, and how all of that's likely to affect demand for electricity. At the same time, they wouldn't be overly prescriptive, leaving space for utilities and system planners to execute those plans in ways that keep costs low and maintain reliability. Now, while these plans would be non-binding and informational, they would allow regulators and other actors to make informed and critically defensible decisions. And they would also help guide future government policy. And we actually heard this from regulators themselves, that without this, they just don't have the basis to make the kind of decisions that are needed. So governments need to provide some guardrails so that regulators can plunge into this space without having to make all the decisions and make decisions that aren't vulnerable to being overturned on appeal, because there's a defensible evidence basis for it. I'm going to pause here and talk about something I was going to get to in the Q&A, which is evidence that this matters a lot. So this happened after the launch of the big switch. My city, the city of Ottawa, had an energy plan that is roughly in line, maybe a little short of what we're describing here. And in fact, part of that plan was to get building heat off of gas in large part on a certain timeline. That commitment in that plan was enough evidence and basis for an Ontario Energy Board decision this spring that rejected approval of an Enbridge gas pipeline proposal, expansion of a gas pipeline, on the basis that Ottawa said it didn't need that gas in the long term. And this was sort of a mind-blowing outcome. This is an Ontario Energy Board without a climate mandate, without a lot of policy to back up that transition that Ottawa envisioned, making a very real investment decision, or making a very real approval decision in line with net zero on the basis of a city's energy plan. So I've been talking about provinces. Cities can matter a lot here too. So energy planning matters a lot. A lot of climate planning going on across the country in provinces. Energy planning. I mean, we hear this from the regulators, the utilities themselves. That's all well and good, but how are those climate-focused GHG goals going to connect to outcomes in energy systems? This is where I really want to sort of channel your attention and efforts. Ontario needs one. Hammer the IESO, Enbridge, the government to oversee it. There's a big governance rethinking going on in all of this in Ontario. there needs to be pressure for them to do it the right way. And I have a blog related to this that I'll put in the chat that gives some interesting Ontario specific information. So this is sorely needed. Now, the solution to the fourth challenge, I'm going to go a little quickly here because honestly, there's no magic bullet. The truth is it's really up to provinces at the end of the day, how far they go down this path of coordination integration. Federal government can provide the carrots, convening power, funding for a lot of this infrastructure. It's really up to provinces, but part of what should be done here is that any pathways studies that they do should include this option of coordination integration. Very tellingly, Alberta looked at its own possibilities for 2035 net zero and said, it's just astronomically expensive. There's simply no way we can get there. They never even considered in the scope of that study what it would mean to connect more with BC. So of course, you're going to find things like that when you don't play with all the tools in the toolkit. So being clear on what the amount of savings and value would be involved with that is a critical step that we suggest be taken as a way of facilitating more interest, which is often sort of reluctant and cumbersome to get better coordination integration. But the truth is no magic bullet here. Other countries look at us with envy. Every hydro province has a neighbor without. It seems like an obvious solution that we would connect more, but it's everybody who lives here understands and follows this stuff knows it's a lot more complicated than that. But at a certain extent, it doesn't have to be, and hopefully this will change in time. So I'll make this my last slide. What we really show here is that it requires action from both orders of government. Really, we want provinces acting, we want the federal government acting, and we've carved out what we think is a set of roles that stick to their respective areas of jurisdiction. We also have some ideas that I'm just going to skip over now in the interest of time about how federal money could be used on being conditional on certain provincial actions. So taking a role like they do in healthcare, like they do with childcare recently, where federal money is used to support provincially managed systems in exchange for a certain number of high-level conditions being adhered to, not getting overly prescriptive above that, a critical one being energy planning. So maybe that's a good note to end on. I'll pull my slides down here, happy to put them back up during the Q&A. But yeah, I wanted to stop talking so we can get to the Q&A.
Jason, that was a tour de force. Thank you very much for going through all of that. It was really excellent. We have a lot of questions actually, which is great. I'm going to start with, we have a small study group who followed the big switch, and let's start with just a few questions from some of the people in that group. Janet.
Okay, I'm going to follow directly on from your last point, which is that the provinces have the responsibility and the control over the electricity systems, and they need to cooperate. They need to move forward in a coordinated way so that we can meet our national goals. So I've got two questions. One's very specific. What is the status of the Pan-Canadian Grid Council that the feds have proposed to sort of bring the provinces together? And the second one is, can you expand on just some of those specific tools the federal government could use to force provinces, particularly some of our climate reluctant provinces, to do their energy planning, to look at net zero in a wider way than the traditional way they've looked at powering electricity in their provinces?
Yeah, great question. So the coordination and integration thing, I mean, what I think we need to acknowledge here, to be fair, is that strictly speaking, it's not necessary that every province link better with the others and that we coordinate and integrate. It would really be smart because any other way is going to be extremely costly. But we had this really interesting experience where we convened all sorts of people in the sector, government officials, regulator folks, utilities, independent, contributors. And we had a big discussion about this coordination integration thing. And then we put them out in rooms where we paired all the neighbors that have hydro and will decarbonize with wind and solar, and like put them in a room and get them to talk. Fascinating in how different the conversations were. Atlantic Canada understands the benefit of greater integration and is ready to move. And so as we know, Atlantic Loop is a thing. The conversation Saskatchewan and Manitoba, interesting, right? They're both eyeing each other, basically like, oh, yeah, I think we'd be ready to do this. A deal could be done. We're both big public utilities. It's really just two people talking or two groups talking. Ontario, Quebec, yeah, they could sort of recognize the value, but it was almost like they were looking at each other suspiciously, like, yeah, but the price matters. Like, it's all about the deal. And we haven't made a good deal yet. And then you had some people skeptical about whether it would even be a good idea. Alberta and BC, in the Stone Age on this conversation. You couldn't even convince that room that there's value to integrating, let alone that it would be possible and useful. You have also there two very different systems, a mostly private and an entirely public one. So what that showed us is that, you know, an east-west grid may happen one day. More likely, we're going to get pockets and regions doing more and more coordination integration, and we should work with and facilitate that wherever there's opportunity. So I think that should be the vision for the Pan-Canadian Grid Council, that it's really about enabling conversations, doing better sort of studies and analysis to determine what the value would be. And I don't think the federal government, unfortunately, can do a lot more than that. So there is some legal analysis from a constitutional scholar saying, in fact, the feds have the power to build interties across regions. They haven't done it, but it's the same power they have with pipelines. They haven't done it today. And I think it's an untested question. Really, I think it's carrots and there's not a lot of sticks. And really, if you're thinking sticks and ways to really advance this, it's pressure on the provincial governments based on knowledge of just how much value is being left on the table. There's this reflexive idea that, oh, we're exporting jobs if we're importing somebody else's power. And like, yes, in part, but you know, the gains of trade is a well-established principle. You might be getting jobs in whatever province if you're not looking to coordinate and integrate, but your electricity ratepayers are going to be paying through the nose because it's going to be a lot more expensive for you to do all this by yourself. So I think at the end of the day, it's something we have to recognize. Look, like, we don't have to go so all in on this idea that there's no other way. It's really a matter of, this is the smart way, and we should drive it forward as aggressively as we can, wherever we can. But where you're facing a stone wall, I mean, it might be better to focus on other things. Like Alberta and BC might need a change in governments before they're willing to see eye to eye on this. That they're going to be the last, if anybody's ever going to move. I got to go faster on these questions if we want to get to a lot. Energy planning and what the federal government can do. There, I think it's carrots again, that they have the stick of the clean electricity standard, of carbon pricing. That can help with incentives to get cleaner. But the truth is, when it comes to bigger and smarter, you really want the provinces acting. And there, it's all about carrots. And so our suggestion has been big structural funding for electricity system transformations on the table for provinces if they agree to certain conditions. Those conditions being participate in the Grid Council, which is mostly just an information sharing platform. It's not a lot more than that, but that's really valuable. Second, mandate your public institutions for this goal. But third, decide for yourself what your net zero energy future looks like. This is not the federal government projecting its vision onto provinces. In fact, be hands off and say, look, if you make your own net zero energy plan and do it whatever way you want in terms of what that pathway looks like, here's the federal money, which can then be transferred with confidence and untied with confidence. The funds would go towards the right things, because that the ripple effect of those changes being made by provincial governments of mandating the institutions and then giving them the high level roadmap they need to move forward, the ripple effect of that is huge. So much flows from that. So we think provinces should do it for its own sake. And we say, look, if you're the federal government, use the carrots that you have and make it a giant carrot to get provinces to the table and let them come one at a time, just like it was with childcare. You know, rather than some huge health accord approach where we talk to every province at once, who wants a bunch of money for electricity system investments? So I say all that recognizing spend federal money is the least original idea in Canadian climate policy history, but it's about the strings you attach to it, which don't have to be that onerous. You just have to ask provinces to start making these decisions for themselves.
Thank
Thanks
you.
very much, Jason. That's great. Another question from Liz Addison.
Hi, thanks, Jason. Thanks, Karen. It was a wonderful explanation of a lot of information. My head is going to explode right now. Okay, so you've said yourself, and a lot of people know that the cost of renewables has declined precipitously in the last few decades. And you were saying yourself that they are now cheaper than fossil fuel alternatives. So the question is, why does the preference of some decision makers still appear to be for gas over renewables? Why aren't renewables the first choice? And what is it about the cost structure of these two alternatives that we don't understand? are there other factors at play?
So great questions. And I'd say a few things. First is culture and inertia, right? Like I think everybody understands this, that it just seems like you talk to governments, you even talk to people in utilities that aren't necessarily up to speed on just how much has changed in this space. And there's just this sort of feeling like if you're in a province that uses a lot of gas and nuclear, well, that's what we know how to do. That's what we do here. Hydro, that's what we do here. But you layer on that the fact that in fact, a lot of Canadian systems have been half overbuilt for a little while, and that was the problem 10 years ago. So they're not really on the page of needing to build a lot of new stuff at this point. So they're not necessarily this isn't front of mind. It's really only become front of mind since we and others have been hammering that, like, to get serious about climate change means massive building of electricity systems. So I think people are kind of tooling up for this idea, but to be fair, it's also this idea that, well, we didn't really think we needed to supply grow right now. And in fact, last time we did, we kind of got burned on it because the demand didn't materialize. So they're cautious, they're skeptical, and understandably so. That's all part of it. But at the same time, there is also this sort of reluctance in some of the more vertically integrated public monopolies, which we have a lot of in Canada, to sort of be bold and progressive and to innovate on this file. And there are ways of shaking it up. It doesn't have to be that they start building this stuff. In fact, Quebec has recognized it needs to grow. And rather than figuring out how to get into the renewables business, it just did an auction for capacity and said, okay, come on, private sector, let's build it. Let's get an independent power producers sector going here. And leveraging that private sector dynamism is the way. Case in point, Alberta has some of the most, healthy growth of renewables across the country, not a place that you think of as sort of the sort of openness to those things. And because they have a private system that really does respond to market forces. At the same time, though, they had a government under Notley that procured renewable capacity, did it at auction, and did this sort of contracts for difference thing where, like, we'll buy it from you and then we'll sell it into the power market because we want to make sure we get more renewables in the mix. This is all going a little too slowly otherwise. The government has made money on that sense. There was a study that came out proving that recently because the costs came in lower than they thought and power prices ended up being higher than they thought. So it had a jump start in Alberta and it's continuing to grow simply because of the economics. So all that to say, culture, inertia, all these barriers, and just sort of, the fact that we haven't been in growth mode for a while is holding it back. Another thing, though, is that, what you're going to bump into in these conversations is a couple things. One is this assertion that, the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. Like, okay, thanks. Yeah, I've heard that before. It's not a new idea, but you hear it anyway all the time. And what you can say in response is flexibility. Of course, yeah, that's true. So we need to think about flexibility. Really, though, I think these conversations get the most frustrating when everybody sort of starts to game out, well, what does a fully net zero electricity system look like? How do you balance intermittency without gas? That's a problem that's pretty far down the road at this point. And when we talk, so the reason I'm circling around all of this is that when you say renewables are cheap, that's not enough to people who live and breathe in this space, because they start thinking, yeah, but I need to balance the intermittency. I can't build a grid on renewables alone, which is true. So the answer can be, number one, yeah, there are solutions to that. Hydro, if you've got it, you've already got a solution. There are other solutions for other places. But the second answer can be, really, you don't need to think about full balancing until a little further down the road anyway. The point can be, renewables are cheap. We ought to be building more. The arguments for why we shouldn't kind of fall down because really they're about a long-term problem where we have to really start thinking about how to have no gas in the mix. But there is a fair point there about, it's not as if I can just build an entire grid on wind and solar. I need to think about how to integrate that. What is demand side management, interties, storage, or these other sources of power? What is all that going to cost? And to be able to sort of speak on to that side, I think you have to say those things to be credible. Otherwise, you get a knee-jerk reaction of like, yeah, but you say wind is cheap. I can't go off wind alone. Fair, but nobody's saying that either. So that would be my sort of basket of answers to your question.
Okay, thank you. I noticed that in the chat box, a lot of people are asking about the situation in Ontario, and I do hope that you get to some of those questions. Thanks.
We will. We'll just have one more question from Jennifer Penny about something that is important in terms of demand management. Jennifer.
Thanks very much, Jason. Your presentation really kind of emphasized the supply side changes that were needed. You did mention demand and demand reduction and so on through energy efficiency, but I'd actually like you to address that a bit more. I just wonder to what extent you think that we can reduce the demand and the pressure on the expansion of the electrical systems by demand side policies, that is to say energy efficiency and conservation, and what would be the most important of those areas to address. In your Net Future document, you talked about demand side on buildings, on vehicles, and on industry. So those are my questions.
Yeah, so great questions. And two things to say on the demand side. The first is that, as I said in the presentation, this is really just a supply side focused piece of analysis. There's a lot to think about when it comes to deployment and uptake of EVs, of heat pumps. So like that's a whole world unto itself. We're going to get there in time, but I am talking more about supply. When I talk about demand side management in this, it's a sort of, I didn't say it this way, but it's kind of another source of supply. That if energy efficiency and the shifting of demand through the day create the need for less supply. So it's an indirect form of supply. And our point has been, we should think about it that way. And in fact, utilities and regulators should do procurement processes that value efficiency and demand side management as alternative sources of supply. And there's interesting ways to do that. Nova Scotia has an energy efficiency utility. Their job is to cobble together projects that deliver energy efficiency and submit these to the regulator, almost like it's another source of power. Great idea. But by and large, the biggest thing to say about efficiency is that it will be a policy challenge, because you're kind of trying to suck and blow at the same time here. You want lots of efficiency, and one of the best ways to get efficiency is for the price of energy to be high. And I'm mostly talking about electricity here, because all natural gas prices, if they're higher, there's a greater incentive for efficiency. So, but let's focus on electricity. You want people to be more efficient in their use. You want it to cost more, ideally. But if you want people to electrify and adopt EVs and heat pumps, you want electricity cheaper. So they're kind of pulling it, you're kind of being pulled in both directions there. So the truth is that we are going to have to figure out clever ways of creating incentives for efficiency, while at the same time not wrecking the incentives that we want to provide for electrification. And one of the ways to do that is, I mean, if we're talking about electricity, efficiency is kind of less the point than it used to be. It's a different type of efficiency now, of flexibility, that it's not necessarily, if my house can use less energy, less electricity, I can use less electricity, great. But in the energy system we're moving towards, where there's more intermittency in wind and solar, it's not that electricity is so scarce, it's that it's time depending, right? There might be periods where we're generating lots of electricity, tons, and in fact, it's very cheap to use them. There are other times of the day where it's extremely scarce. So one of the most valuable sources of energy efficiency can be not only reducing the level of demand, but shifting when it occurs. And so there's lots of clever ways to do that. Ontario is, to its credit, ahead of most on this with time of use pricing. That shifts people to run their dryers, to run their appliances off of peak. That's a really important source of energy efficiency from a system cost perspective. So in the future, I think there's a much more complex and interesting kind of vision of this, where you don't really put as much of that on the consumer, and your electricity bill, say, it might be 10 years before people really kind of warm up to this idea, but it works more like a cell phone plan where, okay, I'm going to go on this type or that type. And really it might involve things like, okay, well, this one is cheaper, but what it means is that I have a special plug that is between my dryer and the wall and my other appliances, and my utility decides when it flips on. I press go, and when power is generating in surplus, then my dishwasher runs, then my dryer runs, then my EV charges. And it's these kind of shifts in demand that are really going to be one of the most important sources of energy efficiency. But just that traditional kind, that brute force kind of, better insulation on houses, we want all that too. The challenge is in the pricing of electricity and rate structures. It's tricky. It's a really hard design problem, but absolutely we should be making those sorts of investments. The last thing I want to say here is that we've been talking about policy a lot. And another really important thing that that sort of engaged groups like yourself can do is not only about policy, but it can get to policy, is becoming some of the first movers on this stuff, right? That adopting a heat pump in your house. I mean, some of you have more means than a lot of, other Canadians. They're expensive at the point of purchase, but we need to build familiarity and experience with these technologies, electric vehicles included. Another key example, there's something called the neighbor effect, which is where I see my neighbor has this thing, I learn about their experience, and I'm less skeptical or opposed. It's real. So being some of the first movers that adopt a heat pump, that adopt an electric vehicle, that figure out how to electrify to do the big switch is critical. And it's not just for that neighbor effect. It would be really interesting. Many of you are in Toronto, and I'm aware of this sort of quirky bylaw that your heat pump should be out of sight. Well, that is really a constraint on your ability to adopt one. So weird rules like that are going to need changing. And what better way for people to figure out what those problems and barriers are for the first movers to give it a shot, figure out what barriers they encounter, encourage their neighbors that, look, this is doable, it's not so bad. And at the same time, hammer City Hall on get these stupid barriers out of the way that you'll have discovered firsthand. Because the truth is they're so unique in every jurisdiction, and we need to figure out what they are to get them out of the way.
Thank you.
Well done, Jason. That was terrific. I think we should move and ask some of the great questions in the chat. I've got Michael Barkley is looking. What do we have?
Hi, Jason. I'm not going to address them in the order because we only have about 10 minutes left for these questions. So I'd like to follow up a bit about the Quebec issue, because there were a number of questions about the cancellation of the agreement with Quebec. And if you could address that a bit more, that would be helpful. And Rolly has noted in the chat that there's an action in November around that particular issue. So Rolly, if you could unmute yourself and just explain that very quickly, because we don't have much time.
Sure.
And that would be helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And hi, Jason. I know you're from Ottawa, so maybe you can join us. On November the 19th, a group of us is organizing, we're calling it the Extension Cord Action. So we're literally going to roll extension cords across the Chaudière Bridge from the Quebec side to the Ontario side, and people are invited to join us with extension cords on their backs. And so we're going to be lighting something up, hopefully from power from Quebec, but I don't know how that's going to work. We need engineers on this. But the point is, we're making that statement and working with the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. And this is, of course, following the announcement that the agreement to buy hydro from Quebec is going to be terminated next year sometime. And some of the pushback is that, well, Quebec doesn't have enough power for Ontario's needs and so on. I'd just like you to address that a little bit, because we want to be accurate in what we're saying, some of our talking points. Can Quebec provide additional, power needs, or is that just blowback, political blowback that we're hearing from the Conservatives?
Yeah. So one thing I just want to do before I forget, I'm just going to drop, as we're talking about Ontario, that blog I mentioned earlier about the governance rethink going on electricity, that matters a lot. And it's relevant here because the way we do planning, the degree to which we consider these sorts of options could be facilitated. Changes could be facilitated by this process that's going on that we discussed in the blog. But number one, I love that idea. Extension cords, that is amazing. I hope you light up a Christmas tree or whatever it's going to be on the Ontario side. I mean, I think it's Quebec is increasingly realizing that they might not have as much power for export as they assumed when they look at their own need to electrify. At the same time, they're also aggressively pursuing export opportunities with the United States. So it's not as if there isn't a surplus. Now, I think what the implicit point being made in Ontario there is it may not be as cheap as many people assume. And that may be true. But absent a full accounting and reckoning of what it might cost and what the alternatives to Quebec Power would cost, how is anybody supposed to make heads or tails of this? And the IESO is not really doing that. And they have a study coming in November that's going to look at a moratorium on new gas plants. It's a single scenario, from what I understand. The analytics to do these sorts of things is hard. So I have some sympathy for them, but let's get serious about understanding what the pathways are. It's hard for me to answer the question honestly, because I think that a lot of the modeling we looked at is quite high level. these very specific, site-specific infrastructure investment choices. When you're talking about like physically modeling an electricity system, that's what these system operators do. We're sort of spatially abstract. So it becomes hard to weigh in credibly on these very specific decisions. But we need better information. So I think we should press everyone involved for that. But I think, yeah, a reflexive pushback on the idea that it's not an option or it's just not there. Absolutely not. I mean, power can flow two ways. That if the more renewables this is the irony, the more renewables we build, the more that we will need to export when it's overproducing, when there's a surplus. And what better place to export that to than Quebec, which can use that power to power its own jurisdiction and allow their reservoirs to fill what is basically a giant battery. So that relationship can exist with the US. It can and should exist with Ontario. But the case for it isn't as compelling when we don't have a big base of renewables, which we should have. We should not have canceled those renewable projects. But it's a difficult topic when the greatest benefits from trade, for now, do honestly flow more in one direction than the other. The argument should be that in the long term, building this infrastructure and maintaining it and using it and growing these relationships can result in two-way mutually beneficial trade. And I think you can reject the idea that it will always go in one direction. And even if it is going to go mainly in one direction initially, what is the cost of that relative to the alternatives? We don't have clarity on that. And the reason we don't is because it hasn't been provided, and it ought to be. Ratepayers and citizens deserve a full answer on what that would actually cost relative to the alternatives.
Great. Thanks, Jason. I'm going to bundle a couple questions from Dennis and Barbara around nuclear, both the possibility of the small modular nuclear reactors and whether that is a solution or not a solution. And it seems like internationally, nuclear is becoming more popular because it's theoretically a cleaner fuel. So I'm wondering if you could address that.
So Don Pittis at the CBC, a business columnist, had a great piece on nuclear just this morning, where he quoted somebody who referred to it as the most religious form of energy, where people just have very strong opinions one way or the other. And it's just one of these ones that's sort of puzzling when you look at how dug in everyone is on this. I mean, we're a bit more agnostic on it overall, that like, look, we need to grow all sources of clean power. Nuclear is one of them. If we take it off the table, the job gets much harder. The question is, if you're going to build something new, what are the relative costs of each? Now, if we're talking about new sort of large nuclear, the conventional kind we have till now, the construction timelines are long. They're very vulnerable to cost overruns. This SMRs thing, the small modular reactors, has captured a lot of interest and attention, and the applications of it are different and promising. Ontario actually stands to be one of the jurisdictions that might get a first crack at this, because they had a site that was already approved for this OPG. They brought together some partners. We might get one of the first one of these things. And the Canada Infrastructure Bank has made a big $1 billion investment in it. When we think about those kinds of things, like the first trial of a new technology, we shouldn't only think of it in terms of the kind of actual cost compared to its alternatives, because there's a co-benefit there, a significant one of we're experimenting and building experience with a new and emerging technology. It's a form of research and development. So, demonstration projects. So that matters, and that's real. It's when we get that like religious dogma, level of attachment to nuclear that I think we should raise our eyebrows. That certainly nuclear belongs in the mix. It ought to be given a kick at the can in terms of being able to compete with other sources. But if you're hearing somebody who's rejecting wind and solar and trying to divert attention to nuclear, no, it should be an all of the above conversation. And let's have a serious and credible conversation about what its real costs, benefits, and opportunities are. But on balance with SMRs, I think there's a lot of potential there. Will it all bear out? I think it's anybody's guess. We'll see how economical and widely, uptaken these technologies are. It's certainly worth a shot, though, to try to build experience with it. Do we want to, hitch our wagon to that and build and bet on a future built around it entirely? Absolutely not. But should it be part of the things we're considering? Sure.
Great. And sticking with the supply side conversation, storage technologies, is there a particular direction that we should be taking in relation to storage? Are there different alternatives? Is there one technology that sort of stands out above others?
So we've got a section in the report that talks about storage and all the many different technologies that are currently being experimented with on that. The one that stands out that is there and it's ready today is lithium ion batteries, short duration. You're talking about like 4 hours. They're there, they're ready, they're deployed all around the world. So these things can and will be playing a role all across Canada. But really, I mean, it's the longer duration batteries, we'll see how a lot of those bear out. It's much more uncertain. Hydroelectricity is a form of storage itself. Reservoirs are a form of storage. And so we should think about them that way. But if we think of like the technological means, there's all kinds of interesting whiz bang sort of chemical solutions. There's gravity ones where you like literally push a heavy train up a hill and then let it come down when you want the power back. These things, it's all very unclear and uncertain just which ones of these might win the race and be able to be competitive. Short duration lithium ion is there today. Other things, including hydrogen as a potential form of storage, very unclear. A lot of them are viable. It's simply a matter of how cost effective they'll prove to be. But again, we don't have to know all the answers to this. Smart procurement, smart policy design by utilities and regulators can say, we have a storage need. We need this delivered, this type of storage. Let's hear it from the market. What sort of solutions can be brought to bear, and just leverage the power of the market here. Let these things compete. And that can be done through smart design of procurement processes, which the last thing I would say about that, I don't even know that we should be procuring for storage per se. We should be trying to do procurement for flexibility as a service. That can include demand side management. It can include storage. It can include transmission, and it can include dispatchable forms of power. And I've talked to people at the IESO who say like, that is possible. We can design procurement that way. We're not trying to buy storage really. Increasingly, we should think of it as we're trying to build as much wind and solar as we can, and we're trying to get as much flexibility as we can to unlock the cheapness of those forms of power. So let's design procurement and processes that get us those two things in smart ways that unleash the power of the market. That's the real point. No, we shouldn't have to know which technologies can compete. Let's let them compete and let's see which wins.
Great. Can you briefly explain output-based electricity pricing?
Briefly, yeah. I don't know about that.
Very briefly.
Okay, I think the best way to do that is I have, of everything I ever did at Eco-Fiscal Commission, there was one blog that I wrote that just like went crazy in terms of the amount of readership and continuing readership that it got there. It's going to take me just a minute to find, but it's a plain and sort of common sense, plain language explanation of what the hell output-based pricing is. It's very hard to explain in a nutshell here. I found it now. So I'm just going to point to the blog for that, and I'll just share this here.
Okay, great.
Really, the point is it's a different type of carbon pricing that we apply in sectors that are emissions intensive and trade exposed. So a lot of emissions, and they compete globally. If you just hammer them with a carbon tax, you don't lower the emissions, you just put them out of business. They can't compete globally. So you need a special approach that thinks about that. For our purposes, we do not think that applies in electricity, and electricity should not get this treatment. Other sectors like cement, steel, oil and gas, there's a case for it. So in terms of what the hell it is, I'll point you to the blog. Impossible to explain more briefly than that, unfortunately.
Okay, great. And one last question then. Your opinion about centralized versus decentralized power generation and management, like that's a big sort of conversation that's going on as well.
Yeah, hugely important. No easy answers there. I would say the same thing there that I said about these various technologies, though, is we just need to make sure we're setting up a level playing field, and let's let these things play the role they need to play. That includes the ability for these producers to feed back into the grid. Like when I'm producing more than I need, I should be allowed to supply the grid, and I should be paid a fair value for what my power represents to the grid at the time it's being delivered, which can vary. So we need to set up those systems. The other funny thing, though, about these sort of things is you can look to California, tons of rooftop solar there. Why? Because of the bad way they've designed electricity tariffs and rates. Instead of paying for, well, there's a certain part of our bill, we have this in Ontario, which is good. The distribution system costs, the transmission system costs, you pay for those in a fixed charge, and then you pay a part of your bill that depends on your level of usage. In California, they bury all of that into a per kilowatt hour rate. What that does is it creates incentives that, if I put rooftop solar on and I only need a little bit of power off the grid here and there, and I can mostly produce my own, great, I pay almost nothing on my power bill. But really, I benefit a lot from the grid. I still have access to reliable power when I need it, yet I'm paying almost nothing to maintain the system. What that does is create distortions for how cost-effective and valuable that kind of distributed solar actually is. And in fact, the richest households that can afford solar panels end up not contributing proportionally to the maintenance of the system that they're still benefiting from, and everybody else gets stuck with maintaining those costs. So all that to say, there are weird ways that electric billing and power systems are set up. They were never meant to accommodate this. This is a new thing that's emerged in the next 10 years. So we need to be smart about the incentives and the structures we're creating that allow distributed power to compete with centralized power. We should not assume that everybody having their own solar panels is a smart way to do this. In fact, it may not be, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to make sense in some places either.
Great, thanks. So I think that comes to the end of our questions. I think we did have a couple more, but we're at time, I think, for questions. I really appreciate this, Jason, and everybody who added their questions to the chat box. It's really appreciated. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. This was fun.
It was really excellent. Thank you so much, Jason.
So I also have the pleasure of thanking Jason for a really wonderful talk this morning. I think that you have really given us a new appreciation for the grid and for the transition to a more sustainable form of energy. And also, you've talked about some of the complications, but also you've given a pathway forward. So we really have a much better idea of the importance of several paths forward. And I think you've really opened our eyes to what is involved and how we can move forward. And I think also you've left a lot of us with a sense of optimism that this is possible, that there are solutions and there are people who are working on them. So thank you so much for giving us your time and your knowledge and your expertise and your patience in answering our questions. And really thank you to you, Jason, and the Canadian Climate Institute for all the wonderful work you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks back to all of you as well for the great work you do. It's always great to see people so engaged in these topics. So yeah, happy to spend the time today. Thank you.
Since we've been so busy talking about electricity and how important it is, we thought we would really have a very down-to-earth action of the day. And one of the things that we want you to think about is the fact that it's going to get colder. And by lowering your thermostat just 2 degrees, you can really save quite a bit of energy. And we hope that everybody will think about that. We're not specifying from where to where, but if you lower your temperature by just 2 degrees, you will find that you are saving energy and contributing it back to the grid. Okay, so in just a few minutes that we have left, we're going to talk about the upcoming events. We're in the month of November. So as Jason mentioned, and as many of us are aware, COP27 is coming up in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. And you can see the website, which is there, the goals, the ambitions of COP27 are, first of all, getting the financing for climate action. I think we all understand how important that is. Forming a net zero coalition, looking at climate adaptation. Again, world events have certainly shown us how important that is. Making a better, more equitable, more just recovery, and also looking at renewable energy. Next slide. So our interest groups are going to be meeting in November. So the first one that's going to take place is the individual action group. That will be taking place next Tuesday, November 8th. Karen and Carolyn are the leads on this. And Michael Berger is going to be talking about biochar, what it is, how it fits into climate change, etc. And also we'll have our usual conversations about the successes and challenges that each of us face as we work through our efforts for climate change. Next slide, please. The Climate Advocacy Group is going to be meeting on Wednesday, November the 16th. That's our usual time for a meeting. Jennifer McKelvey, who is the City Councillor for Ward 25 and Chair of Toronto's Infrastructure and Environment Committee, is going to be talking to us about the city's climate, energy and resilience plans, and how the city is meeting its goals to become cleaner, greener, and more sustainable. And Michael Barkley and Karen Sadlier-Brown are the leads in that interest group. Next slide, please. Going on to nature-based solutions, they actually are hoping to have 2 meetings. The first one on Monday, November 22nd. There is going to be a biodiversity conference, COP15, because those COPs take place less regularly than the other COPs. And this one is about biodiversity. So Joanne is wondering if a number of people who are in the nature-based solutions or other people who are interested would like to meet Monday, November 21st at 10 a.m. to talk about what they're hoping for from COP15, how to watch what's happening there. And Joanne has a number of articles and a lot of information. So if you're interested in learning more, please do contact Joanne at nature.based.solutions@climate-learners.ca. And I think we will be following up with an email about this. And then the next day, Tuesday, November 22nd, is their regular meeting. And Jonah Rani, a landscape architect and urban planner, is going to be talking to the group about nature-based solutions in urban environments. Okay, next slide. In our newsletter, you may have read that we were thinking about doing the climate change tours at the ROM in December. When we investigated a little further, we found that it would be smaller groups. And in the interest of hopefully a lot of interest in this, we decided that we would postpone looking at this exhibit until probably January. And again, you will hear more information about it. And next slide. But the date, December the 7th, which we had asked you to reserve, we are going to have some kind of social event. So we are asking you, save the date of December 7th. We hope to have a social event where we can get together, see each other face to face, have some interesting conversations. And we're looking at planning this. So if you're interested in helping us to plan this event, helping us to carry it out, please contact us at our contact.us@climate-learners.ca, and we'd be very happy to have your assistance. Okay, next slide. So we want to wish you all happy holidays. There will be no interest group meetings in December, but as I say, December 7th, we hope to have this social event where we can all get together. And finally, one more thing. Our next meeting, which will take place on January the 18th, so giving people a little bit of time after the holidays, we're going to look at Canada's response to biodiversity loss. We're hoping that we will have input from the Nature-Based Solutions ad hoc group about this meeting. And this is just a reminder that the COP15 is actually taking place here in Canada, in Montreal, December 5th to 17th. The topic is biodiversity, and we hope that there will be a lot of interest in it, and we have the website listed again. So finally, we hope that you will contact us. So again, we have our usual email, contact.us@climate-learners.com. You can join our mailing list, and we have the URL there. And also, if you have heard about our interest groups and are interested in joining, you can certainly get in touch with us also at this address. And we are working hard on our website, so we hope that we will have it up and it'll make things a little bit easier early in the new, well, not early, in the new year. And finally, we hope that your interest has really been piqued by Jason's wonderful presentation, and we hope that you'll stay a while to have a chat with all of us who are going to stay online. So thanks very much, everybody.
That was wonderful.